Hi everyone. So this is a lecture for my Western Civilization 1 class. It's about Greek medicine. So let me start by saying just a couple of broad things about Greek medicine and then go into the details. One thing which should be apparent for any of you who are going into a biomedical field, including dentistry and pharmacy and many majors we have, is that the terminology we still use comes from Greece. It doesn't necessarily mean that the words themselves are exactly the same thing. Choler means, one thing in ancient Greece. Cholera is something very different today we know as, Vibrio cholerae. But our terminology does come from them, and anatomy and pharmaceuticals are either Greek or Latin. So that's one thing which I think is very, very important. Another is we are kind of obsessed with medicine as a people. I usually ask any given class how many of us can do CPR, and it's usually a pretty big proportion. And I usually ask, do people watch medical drama on TV? Are you interested in it? Do you know anything about basic, medicine? And most people do have an interest in it, regardless of whether they're going into the field or not. So I think that's kind of one thing we owe to the Greeks for our inheritance. But the other is, of course, Hippocrates himself, the father of Western medicine. His dates are 428 to 347 BC, generally recognized as starting the whole attitude toward Western medicine. People still swear his oath today. And many of the sort of basic suppositions in Western medicine still come from the Greek foundations. Certainly the ethical foundations in Greece, such as we'll see in the Oath. But most important may be the rational grounds for medicine. The idea that it should be free from all supernatural influence, from any superstition, from freedom from religion too. Although, of course, people pray to be healed, but a physician should not do that, right? We wouldn't trust someone who said, I'm going to say a prayer for you and you'll be better, right? We trust in rational medicine, and that really comes from the Greeks. We also think that despite, a physician getting a lot of theoretical learning as the sort of basis of their practice, they have to actually have a lot of practice. They have to actually work with patients and get this kind of hands-on experience. And as Hippocrates himself said, ars longa vita brevis. The art is long and life is short. So it's really hard to get all the experience you need to really practice well. And I think certainly our secular attitude toward medicine, I think most of us agree that you wouldn't go to a doctor who didn't have some kind of degree or credentials. You wouldn't go to someone without experience. You wouldn't go to someone who just sort of memorized a couple of procedures and really knew nothing about diagnosis. And even though we do have many different kinds of faith healers in modern society, we generally, most people don't trust them. When you get sick, you go to a doctor, right? I mean, that's just the rational approach. So the interesting thing also about Greek ideas, of course, there are ideas flowing around in ancient civilizations. The Egyptians certainly influenced the Greek pharmacopoeia, and probably many concepts come from Egypt. Alexandria in northern Egypt was a center for Greek medicine for a long time. So I don't want to deny that there's some kind of influence from earlier Egyptian and Babylonian ideas, but they have medical systems that were very, very different. And even though the some materia medica is common to both of these systems, probably because it was available and it's what people could buy. If you knew poppies cause you to sleep, there's no reason the Greeks wouldn't use it. But I think other systems, especially the Egyptian, are filled with things like exorcisms and folk herbalism and astrology and prognostication and amulets and incantations and things, even disease as a kind of divine retribution for wrongdoing. That's in most ancient systems. It's really not there in Greek medicine. Most of Greek medicine breaks away from those things, and I think, to some extent, the Greeks, they believe in the gods. I don't think they take them so seriously when it comes to sending disease or not. And one Hippocratic author specifically says, if the gods are responsible for everything, but there's not a specific ailment. He was thinking about epilepsy, actually, that's given to people by the gods. Now, what is odd is that, recognize, there is a whole body of writings which are generally called the Hippocratic Corpus. It's not one person that wrote them, because there are actually internal contradictions among the different writings. But by and large, you do find there's a certain consistency. When all these texts were gathered together, they had the name Hippocrates slapped onto them. But basically, even though they're written by different authors, and every now and then you will find some very odd things in there that you're thinking like, well, why would Hippocrates have said that? But by and large, the magical and religious kind of healing is not in Hippocratic writing. It's sort of excised from rational medicine entirely. Now, that's not to say the Greeks didn't have forms of that stuff. They did, in fact. There are magical kinds of medicine, but they're not in the Hippocratic Corpus by and large. Now, let's start even before Hippocrates, actually. Let's go back to about 700 BC, 800 BC. There are writings that describe pestilence. Hesiod, actually, remember Hesiod mentions diseases. The Iliad mentions a punishment sent by Apollo upon the Greeks. So these oldest texts, they do seem to say that, the gods have a role in medicine. But the ones that we are talking about, written by Hippocrates, and this is in the years somewhere between 420 to 370 BC. They're roughly contemporaneous with Socrates, actually. They will say they don't mention divine causation. Descriptions of diseases. What makes this confusing in some respects is that their words, the diseases that they mention, like, for example, apoplexy or hypochondria, a stroke. Now, those things, have very specific medical understandings today. They're not necessarily the same thing as in the past. Actually, as I mentioned, anorexia also is probably not. When the Greeks use that term, they're not really talking about the modern anorexia nervosa. But again, our medical vocabulary is based on the Greek, and sometimes someone will mention a disease and it looks like the symptoms are sort of similar, but it's really hard to always know exactly what these Hippocratic authors are talking about. So, for example, a fever can mean many different things. You could speculate maybe this is a typhoid fever, maybe it's malaria, maybe it's... and even when someone says plague, we don't really know if it was bubonic plague. It could be tuberculosis. It could be, any number of things that will have similar symptoms. And recognize also the difficulty, even though there's very, very rich descriptions in Hippocrates of him sitting sort of bedside and describing what people would have experienced, I think that their diagnostic techniques are actually very limited. Remember, they don't have tools. They're taking temperature by hand. They're examining urine for color. Their pulse, they begin to take the pulse by 320 BC. But in general, their descriptions are very hard to interpret, and their prognosis. Prognosis means what's going to happen in the future. It's predicting the outcome. Is really they certainly don't have any kind of quantitative measurement to describe bodily functions. In fact, when the Hippocratic authors describe what's going on in a body, their descriptions are qualitative. They'll say a pulse is fast or slow. They'll describe the human body as hot or cold or dry and moist. They don't really have ways to quantify things, so it's very, very hard to be objective, obviously. It's also hard for one person to replicate what another physician did, because his descriptions are basically qualitative. He can't talk about pulse, heart rate, or temperature, or anything like that. So despite these limitations, I think there's something about Hippocrates that has definitely a modern ring to it. Let me read you or describe on the sacred disease. This is probably dated to about 410. It describes epilepsy, and it says that, disease may be divine or not, we don't know, but this one is not any more particularly divine than any other. And if we want to understand it, we should look to natural causes. We should look to the movement of the sun and planets. We should look to wind. We should look to the conditions that might have led to this ailment, and it really makes an argument for look for natural causes. Diseases come from nature, and that in fact invoking the gods for help is kind of blasphemous. It sort of seems like we're asking them for some kind of favor for us, and that's obviously a power we don't have. So again, people may have been religious, but I think this kind of separation of religion and medicine is a very Western attitude. What's also striking is that Hippocrates, or whoever wrote this thing, is very open to speculation and argument. There's a whole flurry of theories and speculations of disease, and of course they're taking empirical evidence. And I think also something to think about, as we remember we were discussing the importance of patronage, the fact that there's a lot of money spread relatively evenly through Greek society means that people could have their children educated by philosophers, they could patronize the arts, build nice, villas or whatever. But I think medicine should also be thought of as in these terms. If you have a thriving competition and trade in different physicians and people with money to pay them, well, then the practice is going to flourish, right? It's going to be a good competition, good argumentation, and that leads, of course, to speculation, to people coming up with ideas and trying to outperform their competitors. And I think that's what makes Greek medicine so remarkably vibrant. So much of Greek medicine is based on an idea that comes ultimately from Empedocles. Empedocles speculated that there were 4 elements, and remember I mentioned this a couple of lectures back, that make up the universe. They are earth, wind, fire, and air. And these elements in turn influence the fluids that are inside of our body. They're made up of these elements. In fact, the basic elemental theory is in place by about the mid-400s, and it's the one that influences, well, not just medicine actually, it influences science and physics and everything. But that's one important thing is that the theory is humoral physiology is ultimately based on this idea of 4 elements. And we'll come back to humoral physiology in a second. Another interesting feature is that they're having to do with this competition is that there are a lot of different kinds of practitioners. There are certainly folk healers and herbalists and wandering doctors. There are bone setters, there's midwives, there are lithotomists who will remove your kidney stones. And these are all different from surgeons. Surgeons are people who use a knife and cut into you. The medicine that Hippocrates describes is, by and large, for a physician. A physician is not the same thing as a surgeon. A physician is physis means nature, so it's the person who studies the nature of the human body, what we might call physiology. But they prescribe medicines, they prescribe therapies, but they don't cut. Those are two radically different jobs. And and I think this kind of many different kinds of practitioners and really contributes to the innovation. They sometimes learn from each other. They draw from each other's knowledge, and of course some of them, roundly criticize their others and as idiots and fools. But some cities also have a reputation for fostering great healers. Kos is one of those, actually. It's an island that has a cult to Asclepius, who is the god of healing. And here, also Cnidos and Rhodes, they're what, let's just call these medical clans, places where there was a thriving practice and people would actually go there to study. It's not a formal school, but like, philosophers, they had a gathering around and got a reputation, and people would go there to study with a famous person. And shadow a teacher, and you'd usually live with that person, you'd learn their secrets, and usually they're going to pay a fee, right? Or serve as an apprentice in some cases. So we know the historical Hippocrates. There was an actual person named Hippocrates. We know he took fees. Plato actually mentions it at one point. They're contemporaries, and Hippocrates kind of got this reputation for being a great healer during his own lifetime. So he's mentioned in lots of different places. So we don't know there was a real person. Now, how much of this corpus is actually written by him, we don't know. Later writers certainly used his name. The corpus as we have it was probably compiled about 280 BC, probably in Egypt also. So there's all sorts of other things chucked in there. There's anonymous texts. But what is consistent, and we can say in the Hippocratic Corpus, is that all diseases have natural causes. They can be treated with rational therapies. You can use drugs, surgery, diet. But the idea that medicine is rational runs throughout all of them. And what differs among all these writers is actually how the body works, what its physiology. The Hippocratic authors don't know a whole lot about internal anatomy. In fact, when they do dissections, we'll see in Greece generally, they would use goats or pigs. Only in Egypt did they do actual surgical anatomies. So what is going on inside a body? Generally, they have to infer from the external effects. And most of the physicians and writers said that health is a kind of balance in the body, or what they call is eucrasia. Illness, therefore, is a kind of imbalance, which can happen by various means, usually external causes, things like if you eat too much, or you eat with a food that is not good for you, or if there's cold or hot air, or winds, or a certain kind of temperature, or you get too little exercise, or too much exercise, or too much sleep, or too much sex, or whatever it is. All these things will affect our internal chemia, in other words, our balance. And the way that the Greeks describe this is in terms of these four fluids, or humors. Okay, a humor is one of four fluids that flows through the body and kind of regulates our system. The one that dominates, that there's most of in your body, of course, if you cut yourself, you know this immediately, is blood. And blood was described qualitatively as hot and dry. I'm sorry, hot and moist. What did I say that for? The one that is right next is phlegm, and phlegm is cold and moist. There's a quarter of the amount of phlegm as there is of blood. And then 1/4 of that is your yellow bile, which is hot and dry, which is choler, was the Greek word for it. And then 1/4 of that, a tiny little amount, is melancholy, which is cold and dry. And melancholia just means black bile. So notice that these four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, correspond to the four elements. Okay, blood to air, phlegm to water, choler to fire, and melancholy to earth. So it really draws out of Empedocles' elemental theory. Now the idea is that if you have too much of one of these humors, a little comes into excess, you will fall into a kind of sickness. If you have too much hot and dry humor, you get various kinds of fevers. If you have a cold and moist humor excess, you will have a cold. We still call it a cold, right? And these excesses not only affect our bodies, but also our minds. In Greek medicine, we are a psychosomatic whole, meaning that what happens in our body affects what happens in our mind, because ultimately the material that goes into making our flesh, replenishing it through food, through the passage of spirits through the brain, those are actually going to affect your thoughts. So it's not coincidental that when we describe, we still use these terms actually in English. If you talk about someone having a whole lot of blood, they are happy, optimistic, they are sanguine, right? Ruddy-cheeked and enthusiastic. If you talk about someone who is apathetic and soft and lazy, and they're phlegmatic, they just don't care about anything, that's the result of this cold and moist humor. When a person is choleric, they are hot-headed, their yellow bile rises, they're too hot and dry, and actually they're prone to anger and wrath. And of course, when someone is cold and dry, they become melancholic. We still use the term melancholy, but those are medical conditions, and diseases are categorized as an excess of one of these four imbalances. And as I mentioned, because we are a psychosomatic whole, that means psycho is mind, soma is body, they function together. If one organ is affected, it affects the whole other. Okay? And people are affected in terms of their hotness, coldness, dryness, whatever, by their season, by the seasons. You know, cold seasons we tend to be colder. By our age, so when you're young, you have a lot of heat and moisture. As you get older, you get colder and drier. And also by your gender, right? Women are in general softer and colder and moister than men, which is why men have hair and are more aggressive, and women are more passive and fickle, and so on and so forth. So let me also mention that, you know, in regards to age, there's a very common Hippocratic metaphor that life is like a lamp, that it's filled with oil. It burns at one end, and as when you light it, you've got a full thing of oil and full flame. And as you get older, it gets gradually dimmer and dimmer, and the oil is burned off, and then eventually you get colder and drier, and reach old age, and then die. So a lot of the what is humoral physiology, that's a study of the human body based on humors. A lot more gets added to it later, after Hippocrates, by other authors, and especially by someone who actually overshadows Hippocrates in many ways. This is Galen of Pergamum, and I'll come back to him in just a moment. Galen, but this Greek system forms the theoretical basis of Western medicine from this point in classical Greece all the way to the, let's say, 17th, 18th century. Some remnants of it are still remaining in the 19th century. So it's about 2 millennia, okay, 2,000 years. Galen is the basis of medicine. And because it focuses on balance and these external variables, we'll see that there'll be a great reluctance to cut into bodies. And of course, there's very good reason. Obviously, people go into shock when you cut into them. They, they get infections and they die. So the Greek medicine tends to, there is surgery, of course, broken bones and lesions and wounds and such, but in general, the more elite physicians just deal with medicines, and they try not to use harsh medicines because, of course, they know they can harm sometimes more than nothing. Sometimes nature cures a person by itself. So the strength of Greek medicine, unlike ours, in fact, in many ways, this is really unlike, is it focuses on prevention. It focuses on diet before almost anything, and it focuses on those parts of your life that you could control, the temperature, the external effects, the amount of sleep you get, the regularity of your bowel movements. I mean, things like that really, really obsess the Hippocratic authors. And in another sense, they're very holistic, right? Unlike our system. When we have something, organ annoys you, you yank it out. You get rid of your gallbladder. You don't need that. They tend to look at the whole body and human habits. And in that respect, it's closer to other non-Western systems in that they are looking at the whole body. And the focus tends to be on 6 things, which it's actually later Arabic authors give it this name. They're called the 6 non-naturals. Okay, that doesn't mean they're unnatural. It means they're the things that are not part of your own body and your own functioning. They're external factors, and these will be environment. So that would include temperature, humidity, all those other things that we would call, the things that are going to increase the heat or coldness of your body inside. But they're also things like pollution, depend where you live will have a big impact because you're going to be breathing in stuff that's going to affect your body. Sometimes the earth will send up noxious gases into the atmosphere, and that'll cause people's humors to corrupt. That's called a miasma. So they pay attention to environment in a way that we kind of don't anymore, unless you're actually poisoned or, or something, get lung cancer from pollution or whatever. But in general, we don't think of environment as being a major factor in health. They also focus much more on diet. And I should say that in the Hippocratic, in the Greek system, all foods are categorized as predominating in one humor. So if you have a food that's very spicy on your tongue, it's not hot physically, but it's hot because it's actually going to burn your tongue. That is choleric. It's going to increase the choler in your body. If you have something that's phlegmatic, that's cold and moist, like a cucumber, it will actually cool you if you have a fever. So you can see this is actually an allopathic system. You cure with opposites. And all foods are considered medicine because you will, take food in order to rebalance whatever humoral imbalance you have. You can start with food. And food and medicine, there's really no really sharp distinction between the two. If your food is just doing it mildly, medicine is just doing it more powerfully, and changing your humoral balance. So food is considered, well, it's not considered fuel really. It's actually considered that the food goes into your body, it's converted in your stomach, and then it becomes blood. It becomes flesh. It's actually assimilated into you. So there's that whole part that's just the actual material regeneration of the parts of your body through the food that you eat, but also, and of course, the speed of how quickly you digest all of this is very important also. What they called inanition and repletion. It's the, having a healthy digestion and having the sort of enough exercise and heat in your body so that the food is proportioned in quantity, but also in its digestibility. So if you don't get a lot of exercise and you eat something that's really hard to digest, like, rough beans or beef, it's going to stay in your stomach and never get digested, and then corrupt, and then send foul vapors into your head, and you'll get diseases from that. So the speed of digestion, weirdly, is something that they were really kind of obsessed with. They call it inanition, which means to fill up, and repletion, which means to empty out, right? So, or is it the other way around? Anyway, you get what I'm saying. Is that someone who does get a lot of exercise, on the contrary, can't actually eat very light foods because they'll burn up in their very hot digestive systems. Strangely, the Hippocratic authors thought of digestion as heat. I know that sounds really kind of weird, but they thought the food actually kind of cooks in there, and most of the sort of physiological processes, Hippocrates used kitchen metaphors to describe what was happening in your body, which is, I think, very interesting. So in any case, there's two parts to the food. There's one is the speed it goes through your body and having a correct proportion of digestive power and digestibility of the food, but there's also the humoral qualities. So the the, how shall I say this? We actually still use some of these terms that are fundamentally humoral. When you drink a nice martini that is dry, clearly it's liquid. It's not dry, right? But it's dry because it will actually dry out your body. It's styptic. It will cause like a little pucker in your mouth, like tea does, right? The tannins in tea are described in those terms as dry. So all of these things, it's not that the food itself is hot, dry, cold in terms of temperature or humidity. It's that they will actually cause our bodies to react in those ways. So when you eat something spicy, it feels like it's burning on your tongue, right? It will heat up your body. When you eat something that is nourishing and sweet, and they love, sweet things were considered to be nourishing, that's going to increase blood, and that's going to be very good. And wine incidentally, is a necessary nourishment. It converts into blood very, very easily. So that's another thing. So in any case, let's get back to the non-naturals. We have the environment, we have your diet, food, we have the speed of digestion. We also have exercise and rest. And the Greeks, of course, loved their athletics, and they considered that a moderate amount of exercise was necessary to maintain body heat. And of course, it can be used therapeutically. If you're cold, moving around is going to warm you up. If you're too hot, stop and rest, and drink some lemonade, which is cold and will cool off your body. So that's another thing. It's an external factor you can use therapeutically to rebalance, to get that eucrasia. Sex also is something that will, as we know, has a lot to do with heat and moisture. It's one of those things that does heat your body, and actually in excess it will dry out your body. I know this sounds sort of weird, but this idea that runs through Western civilization that masturbation will make you go blind. Well, it's because it dries your brain out. It'll dry the moist organs like your eyes, and that's why your eyesight will deteriorate, because you're getting rid of the vital fluids in your body, and you will. And the other thing I should mention, about sex in particular, this is going to sound also very strange. The Greeks thought that both men and women have sperm. Okay, obviously they don't have microscopes, they can't see eggs or actual male sperm, but they believed that sperm comes from being very well nourished. That if you eat very well and you're healthy and you process your food well, that food will get either stored as fat if you're not getting a lot of exercise, or it will get turned into milk in a woman who's lactating, or it will become sperm. It actually is an excess of nutrition. So strangely enough, the And that excess of nutrition, that excess of sperm, or a plethora is what the word, the technical Greek term for it, will actually signal your libido and tell you, oh, it's time to, reproduce, basically. So so sex, oddly, for the Greeks was a very, very important part of therapy. I know that sounds very. You would never go to a doctor today and have him tell you, well, you're rather well nourished. I think you should reproduce or something like that. But it's one of those external factors that will influence your health and that you can use to do it. And another, very interestingly, is emotion. Emotion is not just the result of your excess of any particular humor, but it can be used as therapy. Right? If you are melancholy, or if you have an excess of melancholic humors, being cheery and optimistic can actually drag you back into balance, humoral balance. So again, the way you counteract effects of imbalances is by introducing contrary stimuli. That's allopathic. It's the opposite of homeopathic, which is you cure with the same things. Obviously, they're not promising miracle cures. There's no immediate results. A lot of these have to do with sort of habitual changes you will make. And sometimes, of course, the recommendation is to let nature follow its own path rather than using violent drugs or anything invasive. And in fact, the oath, I should mention, the Hippocratic Oath, surprisingly, forbids the use of knives. It forbids abortion. It also forbids doctors from administering deadly drugs. And I think the logic of this is like now why we're so worried about euthanasia is, what if a person says, oh, I want to die, I'm on my deathbed? What if the doctor's wrong? What if they really are going to be cured or miraculously, or by chance heal? You're actually killing someone and stopping their lives. So the idea is that a doctor's job is to save people. Under no circumstances should they end a life. And this is something we still struggle with. Very few places have euthanasia laws where a person can voluntarily end their own life, or a doctor can't give them a medicine to do that. So what this reflects, of course, is that in ancient Greece these things were done, right? I mean, they wouldn't have brought it up in the oath if there weren't surgeons around and abortions to procure, and euthanasia as a practice. And I should mention, Hippocrates, kept all these incredibly detailed case histories. He believed, and in fact, it was kind of odd, he believed that the number of days following the change in a person's condition, what he called critical days, would actually determine the course of the illness and when you should administer therapy. And they follow a strange kind of mathematical progression. So on the 7th day, something's going to change. On the 14th, on the 21st, which is really very, very interesting. So we do know about surgery because there's a Hippocratic work on surgery. In fact, there's a lot of sort of things like how to set bones, how to, what kind of posture to maintain when you're wrapping bandages, and how to keep that neat. But it's clear that what they're really reluctant to do is thoracic surgery. They don't want to go near internal organs, or you get someone infected, or they bleed to death, or go into shock. But there are surgical texts. There are also a few gynecological treaties that treat women as Soranus of Ephesus is actually the most interesting, and a large, very interesting debate over females' role in generation. If you remember, we discussed that Galen thought that there are two different types of sperm, male and female, and that women were basically just an inverted anatomy of men. But actually, Aristotle said, no, woman is just an empty vessel, and the man puts in what amounts to like a little homunculus, a little preformed human, and then that develops in there, and the woman really doesn't have any contribution to the offspring, which anyone you'd think would sort of, look at people and say, oh yeah, they get characteristics from both parents, clearly. But Aristotle just thought, no, women don't have any role. And then there's other very strange things like the certain diseases that are very particular to women. The most important of these is hysteria. hyster means womb, so the womb will actually wander around the body and become dislodged, and the physician's job is to attract it back into place. It sounds, when Galen is describing this, it sort of sounds like it's an animal, like you're, luring it with a little piece of cheese to come back into place, which is very, very strange. But it is, but hysteria, the roots, at least what the Greeks were talking about, is a female disease, and it comes from a wandering womb, supposedly. So the next sort of major developments in medicine take place in the Hellenistic world. This is after Alexander the Great. And his various successor states, and they happen primarily, or the most interesting work, I should say, happens in Ptolemaic Alexandria. And this is in northern Egypt, the Ptolemies, with a P, Ptolemy, you should say, actually. That's the place where major anatomical developments take place. And here, it is said that they practiced the first human vivisections, or at least later writers claim this, and I don't know if they're telling the truth. Tertullian mentions it. He may be, just making this up to be, detract from their medicine. It may be that they cut up cadavers, or maybe they cut into live animals. Who knows? But anatomy as a regular practice and as a sort of study in its own right really happens in Alexandria in Egypt. And it is known, or at least it's mentioned by people, that criminals were handed over to the anatomists after execution. They were to be dissected in a museum. And I think, it might not be coincidental that in many of these places, well, in Egypt especially, mummification is practiced. So they're going to know about internal anatomy to some extent. Although, remember, the Egyptians took out the brain and threw it away. That's not important. Save the other organs, but the brain isn't. But in any case, they wouldn't have had any qualms about cutting into bodies the way that maybe other Greeks did, because they thought about the afterlife, or who knows. The connection is a little hard to make, but the two important figures here, Herophilus is one, and Erasistratus is another, and I can spell those for you back when we come back to class. But these are the first two to describe and name internal structures of the body. They knew major organ systems. They know the difference between veins and arteries and the nervous system. So there's pretty sophisticated anatomical knowledge here. They know the structure of the brain in two separate lobes. They know the ventricles and spaces in the brain and things like that. So the and I think to some extent they are using this anatomical knowledge in direct use in surgery, right? I mean, you can't kind of cut into a body and expect to have good results if you don't know where you're going, right? So that's Herophilus. Erasistratus is very important also for the anatomy of the heart, and argued that the arteries, and this is of course a mistake, the arteries contain just air, and that blood flows through and is drawn through kind of vacuum pressure, that the empty ones create a vacuum, and that kind of sluices up the blood into the other system. And later physicians criticize them because if you cut into the vein, there should be air in there, right? There isn't. So, but what is interesting is in his works, his focus on the body is less in terms of humors, this is Erasistratus, and more of the body as a machine, which is really fascinating to me. He talks, for example, of digestion not as heat inside the stomach, but as a grinding mechanism. Of course, you can hear that in your stomach sometimes, right? But he thinks that it's sort of mechanical grinding of food first into a chyme. And then, and if you want to understand how the heart works, it's basically a pump. It's controlled by valves, and these have to do with pressure gradients, and all the organs of the body are basically mechanical features that theoretically, I guess, you could make a model of and then test to see how they work. But his sort of importance of his stress on the mechanical nature of the body weirdly gets picked up in the 17th century again, and they rediscover Erasistratus, and some of his theories are actually revived, especially digestion, which is I find very interesting. So Alexandrian surgery was the cornerstone in medicine in the ancient world. It's pharmacology. There's another figure I want to just sort of throw out here, and if any of you want to do your paper on one of these figures, that would be great. Dioscorides is a sort of the father of modern herbal plant-based medicine, pharmacology. in that he was a physician in the Roman army, still writing in Greek, I should mention, and followed them around all through the provinces and with the troops as they moved, picking up plants as he went, asking people for information about the therapeutic properties, and then put it in this enormous book. So he's not sort of the earliest. I guess Theophrastus, who's a pupil of Aristotle's, is the first real pharmacologist. Also fascinating book. But Dioscorides is really very important. And as you probably know, when we describe plants, the Linnaean taxonomy uses Latin, that is much of which comes right from Dioscorides, or it uses Latin or Greek from terminology that Dioscorides wrote about. So that's another figure I just want to introduce to you here. Another very important thing that happens in later antiquity in the Greek world and the Roman world, which of course subsumes it all, is the development of sects, different groups practicing different kinds of medicine, different schools of thought that follow one particular teacher. And actually this is sort of what happens in philosophy also. If you think back to the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Cynics, having these rival schools and arguing with each other. And at first there are, the Hierophilians, the Erasistratans, the Hippocratics, but another couple of sects emerge. And let me describe these, because they have a different sort of approach to medicine. So one is, if you've practiced rational medicine and follow Hippocrates, the practice tended to be ossified, meaning that they kept with those texts. They didn't make new discoveries. They kind of stuck to his theories and the four humors and that. So they're called usually the dogmatics, okay, the dogmatic sect. And incidentally, if anyone's interested in reading about this, it's all in Celsus, the Roman and Latin writing. He's not a physician. He's kind of an encyclopedist, but Cornelius Celsus writes about these sects in the Roman world. Opposed to the dogmatics, who presumably are following Hippocrates to the letter, are a group of people who are called empirics. Empiricism meaning to try whatever works, use your senses, and then use whatever works, based on trial and error. They don't really have a set of theories underlying their ideas, but they are very, very popular, and basically said experience is the only thing that counts, and there are no hidden causes to disease, and we don't care. We're not going to sit there like Hippocrates at your bedside and watch you die. We're going to give you medicine, and what we have is easy to administer, and we'll just do whatever works. Experience is the only thing to them that counts. And in fact, they didn't even practice anatomy, because they said, that tells us about dead bodies, not what's going on in a living body. So so there's very little theorizing. There's no speculation on the nature of drugs. Either it works or it doesn't, and there's no need to use the humors. Experience is more important than reason. And that means, but what is very interesting, because they had to go on experience, they become very good at case histories. They write down a whole lot of details of things and tell you, this worked with here's this set of symptoms, let's describe it as accurately as we can. So when someone else comes by and tries to replicate this, they can use the exact same medicine and they have a good chance of it working. Another thing about medicine at this time, and including Hellenistic Egypt, is that they are witnessing increasing professionalization of medicine. There are, workshops are organized, what we call kind of a joint medical practice, in which you have to kind of make an appointment, pay a fee. We know there are lectures on medicine in the town gymnasia. There are formal apprenticeships. There are taxes for medicine. So in Alexandria, so there's something like a public medical system, public health, I guess you could call it. What's also interesting is just also realize, if these kinds of physicians don't give you what you want, you go to an Asclepian temple there where there's a cult of healing, and you'll usually be put in a temple. Snakes will slither around you. They'll give you a drug. You'll usually throw up, and then the doctors will interpret what kind of dream you had in the morning. So that's magical medicine, right? That exists alongside all these other forms. And it's a kind of faith healing. And what's interesting is in these Asclepian temples, people would leave little testimonies up on the walls and say, I was cured by these people. And it's kind of like an advertisement, right? I was cured and you should come here too. And which is kind of neat. So, also the time period I'm talking about, let me just clarify this also, is that Roman medicine is Greek medicine. Okay, they're the same, one and the same thing. The Romans adopt the Greek systems. So when I talk about these various schools, they're both Greek and Roman, right? Most of these authors are still writing in Greek, which is the scientific language. And so the Asclepian temples, they exist in Greece. They also exist later in Rome. Very, very popular. So in any case, we got the dogmatists. We have the empiricists or empirics, and then we also have the Methodists. Now, don't get confused by that term because it's obviously a modern Protestant religion founded in the 18th century by John Wesley. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who follow a particular method. This is Thessalus is the actual, supposed to be the founder of this school. And what makes them unique is that they have this idea of health as a balance, not of humors, but of atoms. I know there is weirdly atomic theory in the ancient world, and that diseases are the result of a change in relationship of cells and pores to the body, so that either they get clogged and then the body becomes too moist, or that they get too open so the body's fluids drain out too quickly. And so their solution are simple methods, things that would correct visible symptoms with very, very simple and effective therapies. And so there's no there's not a whole lot of abstract theory under this. And the therapies usually are things like fasting, or taking a lot of fluid to rehydrate, or taking a bath to get rid of excess moisture and obviously sweat out symptoms. And you don't need a whole lot of education to become a Methodist. I think their motto is something like Cito, Jocunde, quick, easy, and cheap, or something like that. And so they become very, very popular in the ancient world. People go to maybe we should call them Methodics rather than Methodists, because that implies religion. But in any case, this is another flourishing school in the ancient times. Now, all of these figures, everything I've said before, gets overshadowed by a figure called Galen of Pergamum. Pergamum is the modern city of Bergama in Turkey. His dates are 129 AD, notice, okay, to about 200, maybe even as late as 216 AD. That's something people argue about. But he's a follower of Hippocrates, so he is a humoralist. He still believes in the four humors and such. And he's important not only because he's the foremost medical authority in the Western tradition for the next 2 millennia, but he kind of summed up everything that went before. He criticizes, in fact, we know a lot of what people wrote before him whose writings have disappeared because he talks about what idiots they are. And his writings, he is the most prolific writer in all classical antiquity, or at least we have more writings that have survived from Galen than anyone else. Over 30 volumes of Galen's writings, 434 separate works. Some of them are little, some are 500 pages long. So he's ridiculously prolific author, writes about everything in medicine. And the reason we know also his dominance is that he got a plum job. He got a fantastic job as the physician to Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his successors, I think Commodus and then another one. And he went along as a field doctor, actually, to serve. Marcus Aurelius is also a really fascinating writer, and in fact was a Stoic philosopher. But the topics he wrote about: anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, pathology, it's the study of diseases, therapy, hygiene, which means not just keeping clean, it means the whole sort of regimen of your life, dietetics. He also wrote philosophy, which is really interesting. But my guess is what happened is Marcus Aurelius was pretty healthy, I think, so he had a lot of free time to just write, and was anything he wanted. And what also makes his work unique is his very personable style. He writes about himself, which some people think, oh, that he sounds sort of cocky, but he talks about how he interacts with his patients. He talks about the therapies he tries, and you get a really, really good sense of what his medical practice was like. I mean, this is sort of, high drama. This is the ER of the second century AD. So now having said that, Galen is prone to bombast at times and boasting, and sometimes, he's a little self-deluded sometimes about how wonderful his healing powers are, but he certainly has this remarkable power of observation, his bedside manner, his recognition that there has to be an essential trust between the patient and the physician, and also his insistence on, having a lot of experience. The theorizing is all well and good, but you need the practice and solid experience. And so, these things in some ways strike me and many other readers as very modern. His descriptions of his patients and his diagnosis, the things, everything is included, everything from A to Z. And Galen also, I should mention, did do dissections. He doesn't do them on humans, he does them on animals, and that's something followers didn't really know until we get to Vesalius way down the road, but they recognized that, I think Galen recognized that sound anatomical knowledge is key to good practice, whether surgery or otherwise, and that you have to somehow look at internal structures, and since we can't use humans, let's use animals. That leads him into some mistakes, numbers of vertebrae, lobes of the liver. I mean, things that get repeated for years and years. But his descriptions of what he saw, his, bones and muscles and things are pretty accurate. The way veins connect to the heart, the way nerves connect to the central nervous system, I think are very good, even though he makes mistakes there too. He said there was a septum in the heart with invisible pores, so the blood goes from one end to the other. He thought blood sloshed from your heart to your extremities, then back again. I mean, I'm not trying to say he made, that he's a modern physician, not at all. But the way he thinks is, in some respects, Galen stressed experiment. He said, do repeated dissections, do clinical trials, come up with a hypothesis and test this, and if something doesn't work, obviously get rid of it. But in a sense, Galen profits from all the earlier schools and took the best parts of every one of his predecessors, and including Aristotle. He borrows from him, and also had a keen sense of the development of diseases, how the effects change, how the symptoms will change over time, what therapies are required, different stages of illnesses. So his and of course, unlike today, if you went to Galen for a diagnosis, he'd want to know your habits, he'd want to know your former illnesses, he'd want to know your diet, the amount of exercise you get, your age, these things that are, nowadays you go to a doctor, they want to know your weight, they take your temperature maybe, they have your case history, but your medical history, but they're not really interested in what you eat, right? Unless there seems to be a problem. But for Greek medicine, the prevention is at the core, and your habits are absolutely essential. And most importantly, he said, anything you do, record it, write it down. Whether it seems important or not, some other physician's going to be looking at your text and saying, oh, here's a case that looks just like mine. I can use this experience and heal someone. So there's really detailed descriptions of physical processes, description of the different types of pulses, for example, I've always found interesting. And the therapies are, well, they're very influential through history. Diet is one thing. Changing your diet and trying to rebalance runs all through the Galenic authors. He was also really into bleeding, and this strikes us as really gross and odd. They would open a vein in the spring and let out blood, or sometimes leeches. Way down into the 19th century, they're still applying leeches to people, and the logic is that your humors corrupt, your blood actually goes bad, and to let it out is a good thing. Just get rid of it. And especially men who don't have menstrual cycles were considered to be especially vulnerable to bad blood in their bodies. So they would routinely let blood out, and weirdly, there's been studies that say when you let out blood, your body rebounds with immune reaction much stronger than it would otherwise, and so there actually might be strangely therapeutic benefit for this. But in any case, a plethora of blood, too much blood, is a bad thing, and bad blood to let it out. There's also cupping, which is still practiced in some places in the world. It's a little, you heat up this little cup and you put it on your skin, and it'll cause the skin to, from the pressure, to sort of extend into the cup, and that's thought to draw out the bad humors. And sometimes they would actually scarify your body, put the cup on, and then the bad humors would come out through the blood, I guess. There's also bathing, very important. So all these things that kind of affect your humors. And then, of course, there's this extensive use of drugs. When you use one drug on its own, it's called a simple. When you use many complex concoctions of various ingredients, it's called a galenical. So it is, there's usually, well, sometimes these get so complicated. Theriac, for example, has 70 different ingredients, one of which is opium. So, of course, it's going to put you to sleep. But it was used as an antidote against snake bites, against rabid dogs, against plague later on down the road. But just sort of characteristic of Galen's medicines is they are very, very complex. They're made for specific symptoms, not, they can't recognize always a specific disease. They look at symptoms, and they work by this, well, they work partly by this rebalancing of humors, but there are things that are emetic, that will flush you out. There's soporifics that will cause you to go to sleep. There's diuretics that will make you pee or sweat. There's digestive aids. There's appellatives, styptics. I mean, there's a whole logic of categorizing medicines that runs through Galenic remedies, and those are used right up to the 17th century, if not sometimes even beyond. Galen mentions a lot of medical instruments that are used, so there are scalpels and scissors and forceps and splints and retractors that hold incisions open. So I want to just sort of give you Galen as the kind of ultimate authority in medicine up until the 16th century, and we'll see what happens with his writings. Is that in the West, at least, when the Roman Empire falls apart, people stop being able to read Greek, for one. They lose his manuscripts, and oddly, they are saved in the Byzantine Empire, which is the eastern half of the Roman Empire, but more importantly, they're saved and translated from Greek to Arabic in Baghdad. When we get to the 8th, 9th century, the Caliph will form what's called a House of Wisdom to translate this stuff into Arabic. So weirdly, the inheritors of Greek medicine, and most science also, which we'll come to later in a separate lecture, is Baghdad, is the Muslim world. And then that Arabic gets translated back into Latin when we get to the Roman Middle Ages. We get the Latin Middle Ages, I should say. And then when that's all recovered, there's a big Galenic revival in the 16th century. And then where we'll end the course, when we get to the 17th century, I'll talk about the scientific revolution. But 2 millennia is a really, really long stint. And people arguing over Galen is really the entire, I guess you could say it's the history of medicine for the 2,000 years following, or the 1,500 years following Galen's death in around 200. So we'll come back to some of that material later. And I think since I wanted to keep this under an hour for logistical reasons, we'll come back to Greek science and talk about Pythagoras and Democritus and atomic theory and all this wonderful stuff. We'll come back to that another time. Okay, so I will see you not Friday but next Monday. See ya.